Okay, thank you very much. Good afternoon. I have the advantage that I have a very sort of lively speaker before me, so I can easily spend the next half an hour talking about what he got wrong. Let me start with some general thought about security of supply. When we talk about security of supply, we normally have very different concepts in mind. And this is one of the reasons why the discussion about security of supply is sometimes very difficult, because people view this in a very different perspective. I think what the regulators have selected to understand under security of supply is kind of affordable, secure, stable supply of energy, electricity and gas. And I think this is also somehow behind a lot of the measures that are taken on the European level. I think what we have to recognize is, and this is maybe also a reason why we have a lively debate about energy policy, is that in Europe, over the last couple of years, we have had a multitude of policy initiatives, sometimes too many. I think we have repeatedly said, well, maybe we have overloaded member states and institutions with new measures, and we need to give everybody some time to implement what is already legally obligatory. And as Inge has mentioned in the morning, member states do have difficulty transposing some of the EU legislation for whatever good or bad reasons. But we are at a time where we are changing intentionally with a certain set of goals many aspects of energy markets. And this is, of course, creating some uncertainty, some unclarity, some confusion by people inside of Europe and outside of Europe. One of the topics, and this is sort of the next point, is that in 2010, Europe decided that we might be better off having a security of supply regulation for gas. And this one was also like the security of supply regulation in electricity, was started after an incident. Normally, politics doesn't really address these security of supply issues unless they are sort of put with their head right into it. And so in 2006, when the security of supply regulation for electricity came into force, we had before, the blackouts in Europe. And in 2009, we had the Ukrainian-Russian dispute about gas transport, which was the initiating sort of event that triggered the discussion about security of supply. Now, it is worth maybe talking a minute about this disruption, which I think provided numerous interesting experiences and lessons to be learned. And I think the European Union did take most of those lessons serious and implemented a number of measures that made sense and that should make us more resilient against future disruptions, whatever sort of part of the supply chain they might come from. What did happen is that a large part of the Russian imports was disrupted. And interestingly enough, Europe was at no time during these roughly 10 days really short of gas. There was every time, every minute, there was enough gas in Europe. We just didn't have enough transport capacity to get it where it was needed. And it was needed mostly in sort of the former communist countries of Central Eastern Europe, the new EU member states, and they have not been well connected with Western Europe. Now, this, of course, has a historical reason. I mean, any Bulgarian responsible person 15 years ago, if they had said, okay, let's build a pipeline to Germany, probably would have ended up in Siberia, because that was not the idea of supplying Bulgaria in the communist times with gas. This was from Russia and nowhere else. So clearly there was no infrastructure for the reverse flow. What we also did learn is that it actually is quite simple to upgrade the grid to support this reverse flow. And even after 10 days, we were able to implement a significant amount of reverse flow from Central Europe to Eastern Europe. So it's a fairly simple and cheap exercise. It just hadn't been done in time before because nobody had planned for it. So I think the lesson is we were able to cope reasonably well in most of Europe. In this part of Europe where we already had a good implementation of diversified gas supply systems, Austria lost 80% of imports and we had no problem. I mean, we had trouble, but we didn't have to cut anybody at any minute. Those countries that had the biggest problems were the ones, let's say, least prepared. So what was then decided that taking the example of a few countries that had managed quite well, there was a benefit in having a common approach to security of supply, because it also became clear that unilateral measures in one country were blocking measures and improving the situation in other countries. So the legal basis now implements an obligation for solidarity. It assures a certain level of transparency and preparedness. It also implemented a mechanism of loose but still, I think, reasonably effective cooperation in a working group of member state level, and it provided some binding minimal standards on those countries. So basically, it's not a huge sort of rocket science, but it says analyze the risk, think about what could be done if some of the risks materialize, have plans how to address those. And then a couple of consultation exercises and some measures that assure that cross-border cooperation, regional cooperation actually does work, and that it's either impossible or very difficult for member states to improve their security of supply at the cost or the expense of neighboring countries, which happened in the 2009 gas crisis. So I think here we have now a system in place which worked reasonably well. At the same time, at this moment, we decided in Europe to implement a number of investments in infrastructure to make it more flexible to address problems, which is basically reverse flow and a couple of small pipeline projects. Most of them are in progress now, and at least a significant share of this European recovery program funds have been dispersed. I think not everything, because sometimes things do take a little bit longer. I mean, this brings me to something that Jeff mentioned before, the Katrina natural disaster, which the gas industry survived very well. I would say yes, I think it is an impressive situation. On the other hand, I think we have to recognize that the electricity industry managed the same disaster much less well in the US. And I mean, the basic civil institutions managed horribly the Katrina disaster in a way that it's almost incomprehensible for Europe. So yes, I think the gas industry did prove that it was able to cover a shortfall quite readily, but I think we should not necessarily say that this is entirely attributable to the US gas liberalization system. I think one other thing that came to mind when Jeff talked about gas pipeline investment, the US has, through shale gas development, changed the source of gas that's used in the US geographically from basically Canada and some parts of the US to very different parts of the US. So obviously there was a big need for new pipeline investment to bring gas from the various shale gas development areas to consumers. Now we haven't changed the sources of gas in Europe geographically a lot. So there's no need to build a comparable amount of pipelines in Europe. And incidentally, a physical or technical simulation of the gas grid in Europe shows that we almost have no congestion. We have contractual congestion, and we need to do something about it, but we have very few physical congestions in the gas grid. So we don't need to build a lot, we need to make better use of what we have. So building another 50,000 kilometers would be a gross waste of money and not really necessary. Of course, we need to improve the systems how to access this, and we are trying to do that. Something that, of course, is of concern is we have, about 2.5 years ago, decided on the third energy liberalization package, and we are somewhat in delay in about half of the member states in transposing it nationally. This is a nuisance, this is bad, but it goes back to what I said before, that we have some problem in overloading the national institutions in implementing all those changes. And this is probably more true in gas than in electricity, because we are changing more in electricity, in gas than in electricity. And the gas industry has always been more successful in lobbying member states to slow down implementation measures than the electricity industry. And we are still suffering to a certain degree from this difficulty in getting agreement among member states on the necessary measures, which, when you look at the first drafts of the second and third package and what the final version was, they were always more ambitious initially, and member states watered them down, sometimes more, sometimes less. I think what we do have now, and this is a big achievement we have in the third energy package, a lot of new instruments which are step-by-step implemented. And I think we also have, maybe together with the gas target model, a quite clear view of what the gas market in Europe should look like in a couple of years. And I would not agree that the entry-exit system is the wrong way, because Europe, with its about 12 to 14 foreign suppliers, maybe another 10 inner-European production sites of relevant scope and production volumes, is a pretty diversified system where the physical need for transport is not that big. So there's a big room for title transfer in Europe. So I think it is very easy to sort of comprehend and also to simulate that a gas transport network in Europe does not necessarily physically need to transport gas volumes from Portugal to northern Germany or from Bulgaria to Ireland, because we have a multitude of sources. We just need to balance the supply and demand across the EU, and I think an entry-exit system is well sort of positioned to do so. I also am convinced, and this is to be read in the target model, we do not plan to have 20 entry-exit systems, which are clearly too many because they would be too small. We are going to have eventually between, let's say, 4 and 6 entry-exit systems in Europe, and I think they would be roughly the right size to enable a diversified supply situation, enough competition, but still not pose too many sort of inefficiency in transport capacity. So we have implemented now a number of institutions. ACER was set up, ENTSO-G is working. It just will take a little bit longer before we are able to get those institutions really working seamlessly together and delivering all the pieces we need. And I think on the gas side, one of the reasons obviously is that we are not dealing within country national production sites and producers like the US on the gas side, but we are dealing a lot with producers outside of Europe, and so we have our share of problems with producers coming from outside of Europe, like the US has problems with their oil suppliers. I mean, I don't see the US being very successful in managing the OPEC supply chain. And we are only moderately successful in managing the supply chain of gas from Algeria, Russia, and Norway. Although we are making progress, I think the old world, the long-term oil indexation, the long-term contracts, very inflexible situations, they are in the process of being changed. And I think in 2 to 3 years, we will have a much, much smaller amount of gas tied to oil. Maybe a third of the price will be determined by oil, not 90% like it was a year or two ago. We'll have much less long-term commitments, much more short and medium-term commitments. And I think we'll set much more prices being set by market signals, by hub prices, by sort of short-term price movements, and much less by longer-term formula-based methods. This is a process which is in the working. It's not easy, it's painful. Companies are making big losses. Producers are concerned. But I'm convinced that after this, let's say, shake-up in 2015, let's say, we will find a more stable situation, and Europe will continue to be attractive for producers from all over the world to bring gas to Europe in different ways. Maybe a word on electricity. Although most of the talk is on gas, I think electricity is in a way different, that it is much more dependent on national European developments, We don't import any significant amount of electricity from abroad. Therefore, we have different issues. And the biggest problem for electricity security of supply is probably inconsistent renewable policy and energy policy, which is homemade, obviously, because it's our policy. And some more consistency would, I think, easily resolve most of the problems that we have. We'll see if we get there or not. I was only moderately encouraged by the previous panel. But I think we need to be sure that whatever policy measures we implement are really well balanced, take into account all necessary aspects, and then I don't foresee any significant problem with electricity security of supply. And I'm also convinced that the gas needed for electricity generation, which incidentally is only price setting in a few number of countries in Europe. I mean, many countries in Europe determine the merit order price not from gas, but from other fuels. But that might change over time. So I think on the electricity side, we are probably currently on the infrastructure a little bit more in an unstable situation, but one that we can easily resolve ourselves, so we don't have to talk to whatever Algeria, Gazprom, and Statoil to resolve our electricity issues. It's homemade, and it's us who can solve them or not. On the gas side, of course, we are part of a European and sort of global gas market. And finally, before I close, briefly about infrastructure development. I think on the gas side, we have now a sufficient number of instruments, either in place with the 10-year network development plans, regional plans, national plans, which are obligatory, a stable financing system for TSOs. So I think it will take some time. And on the gas side, we do not need a lot of new pipelines. We would be well served with a few more import alternatives, like the Southern Corridor, maybe a few more LNG regas terminals. But the rest in Europe is of moderate size, what we need to build in additional gas pipelines. Surely there will be a couple of them that need to be built, but this is not a lot. On the electricity side, we have a huge challenge that I think many people are aware of, and we need to find a solution that provides enough political guarantees for builders and TSOs to build the necessary infrastructure, because energy policy has been somewhat erratic in some countries over the last few years. So I have some sympathy for TSOs who says, why should I build the line? There's an election next year, and maybe the government changes the priorities again. And that is a problem that we have to overcome. But overall, our biggest problem is really permitting in electricity, and in gas, it's just only, under parentheses, organizational and software. I think the hardware is pretty much in place and can be done. And of course, on top of that, we are working on an infrastructure package which will provide some additional help, I would say mostly in remote places where financial situation of TSOs is maybe not that good, so some financial assistance. I think I've covered that. There is a European plan, and it remains to be seen how far we get with implementing these long-distance corridors, and also how we regulate them in practice. And I think we might take some lessons from the US, and maybe to finish that, I think the US has a quite well-working gas market liberalization, so I think we can learn some things from the US. It has pretty much messed up electricity liberalization, so it's fragmented, very badly organized, bad security of supply. But on the gas side, we clearly can learn some things from the US. I wouldn't take all of Jeff's lessons as something we should implement, but clearly some things that the US has done on pipeline infrastructure development, like the full unbundling, sort of total ownership unbundling, has been, I think, a very successful implementation. But we have to keep in mind that this is one state in which this is done. And that's much easier than our job. I mean, if the US would have to regulate Canada, Venezuela, and Mexico together with the US, I'm sure they would have many similar problems to what we have. So, this much as an introduction for the debate. Thank you very much.